Enkanomiya should be called the land of the info dump, because boy did it give us a lot of stuff to sift through. Honestly, I didn't think we'd be diving into the underworld so soon, given that up until this point, Khaenri'ah was kinda the only underground nation we knew about, and that's definitely quite a ways off. I half expected Dainsleif to show up unannounced while I was down here wandering around. But since our resident Bowkeeper isn't around to Dainsplain things to us this time, I thought I'd take a crack at it. So, join me as I recap everything that went down in Enkanomiya, followed by some, speculation. Now, this isn't a full-fledged theory video. Half of this video is lore, and half of it is me just babbling away at speculation. I will try to mark clearly when this shift happens, so be on the lookout for it, okay? As always, take my theorizing in the second half of this video with a grain of salt, as it is not canonical information until miHoYo says so. Also, while I will be referencing the book Before Sun and Moon, I will not be talking about Phanes and the Thrones at length, so if that's what you're here for, sorry. That's in the next video. I do recommend that you read the book before watching this video, though, because we'll be going over it quite a lot. Okay, we good? Cool. Alright, let's do this thing! Watatsumi wasn't always an island, believe it or not. In fact, it didn't even exist until the end of the Archon War. Not as habitable space, anyway. It's said that Orobashi, the god of Watatsumi, used his blood coral branches to form the entire island. But before we get to that, this area was actually occupied by the islands that make up Enkanomiya. In the times before the Archon War, Enkanomiya was indeed a surface nation and was part of one unified culture that dominated the entirety of Tevat. A lot of the architecture we see in Enkanomiya probably stems from that time period and not in the years that they spent underground. I'm making this assumption because of some matching architectural elements within the ruins scattered throughout Inazuma, Dragonspine, and some of the Liyue ones, as well as the existence of Seelie Quartz down in Enkanomiya, which we will talk about in another video. Now, due to an unknown, or rather unspecified, catastrophe that was most likely part of the Archon War, the earth beneath Enkanomiya cracked open and the island nation fell into the underground caverns beneath the sea. This marked the beginning of the Age of Darkness, or the Age of Blindness. It's got two names. The people of Enkanomiya were lost in this darkness and unable to return to the surface, supposedly due to a seal put in place by the gods. Things probably would have been okay, except these caverns were already home to the ancient beasts known as Viships. The people of Enkanomiya called them the Dragon Heirs. Now, the Viships had been underground for countless years prior to the arrival of the Enkanomians, and had adapted to a life of darkness, to the point where they shunned the light. They preyed on the people whose only defense against them were small torches and flames, and while they prayed to their god, the Primordial One, their god didn't respond. At least one generation passes in the darkness, and for reference, a generation is roughly 30 years. So these people were in the dark for at least 30 years, and possibly more than that before they had any signs of hope. That hope came in the form of a sage who had supposedly seen the sun, which is a way of establishing that this sage was around from the time before Enkanomiya fell. The sage isn't mentioned by name, but it's fairly safe to assume that this sage is Abrax, or Aberaku, the creator of the Dainichi Mikoshi, also known as the Helios, and since we're dealing with Greek mythology, I'm gonna stick with Greek terms. They're also shorter. They feel like nicknames. The construction of the Helios was the start of a new era, the Era of Sun and Moon, also known as the Era of Sight, since people could now see since it wasn't dark everywhere. The Helios lit up the underground and drove back the Viships, and the people hailed Abrax as a hero for a couple of years, and he basically just led the people of Enkanomiya as kind of like an unofficial king. At least that's how I've come to understand it. Now, the completion of the Helios brought with it a return to normal life, and with that came human greed. A certain group of nobles question mark decided to seize power. How someone would have nobles when you live in a dark space and dragons eat everyone around, I don't know, but whatever. These nobles crafted a myth that Abrax had constructed the Helios on behalf of the Tokoyo Omikami, also known as Kairos, the god of time, but we'll get to that a little later and also in another video. This myth spread and effectively deified the Helios while diminishing Abrax's achievements as an engineer. The nobles took this myth even a step further and claimed that only a child chosen by this new god, the Helios, was fit to rule. They then chose a child at random, I guess, and called them the Sun Child, and installed them as the true ruler of Enkanomiya. And thus the era of the Sun Children began. Now, when I say child, I mean literal child. This child might have even been an infant at the time. Or, like, old enough to speak, but not that old still. Regardless, the nobles used this child to their advantage, and tricked the Sun Child into effectively executing Abrax through imprisonment. And of course, that wasn't enough. When the child grew old enough to recognize that they were also being manipulated by these nobles, they were then thrown into the Helios in a ceremony known as the Rite of Solar Return. This is more gruesome when you realize that a solar return is the same thing as your birthday. Incineration is not a good birthday gift for a child. I'm just saying. I just also want to point out that due to the vagueness of the texts that we have, Abrax could have been anywhere from 50 to 90 years old at the time of his passing, assuming he's a normal human. This may or may not be relevant. Later. So anyway, with 7 Sun Children in total, estimating a reign of about 10 years each, I'm gonna guess, because 10 seems like a reasonable age for them to be pretty self-aware, but also not aware enough that they realize they're being heavily manipulated. The rule of the Sun Children was probably no more than approximately 80 years or so. Now, Enkanomiya has therefore been underground for, by my estimation, roughly 200 years, being a little generous. Just keep this in the back of your head for now. Anyway, during the Sun Children's rule, a man named Spartacus also led a rebellion at some point, and he was also unsuccessful in overturning them, and I guess he was part of several different rebellions, but he's like the most notable one, and, the Sun Children didn't rule that well, and, I mean, they were kids. They were being manipulated by these noble jerks that were really super greedy. They wanted power, so, it's really not the Sun Children's fault. They were just kids. You get the idea. But while all of this was going on underground, on the surface of Teyvat, the Archon War was still raging. Orobashi, either losing in some battles or deciding not to partake in them at all, retreated to the edges of Teyvat, also known as the Dark Sea, and somehow ended up in the Serpent's Bowels, which is this area here in Enkanomiya. He made himself comfortable and just kind of stayed there for who knows how long. The concept of time in this place is weird. We'll talk about it later, but it's weird, okay? It's really weird. During the reign of the 7th and final Sun Child, there was another unnamed child that was not a Sun Child who made a bet with all his friends and set off to find something called the Dragon Bone Flower, which is basically a flower that grows, you guessed it, on dragon bones. You can actually get this in-game. There's a whole quest line about it. It's like a secret thing, but the hunt for this flower took him to the Serpent's Bowels, where he found, you guessed it, Orobashi. This kid asks Orobashi for some reason if he can become Enkanomiya's god, and Orobashi agrees even though he was losing the war above and didn't want to fight, but now he's going to be a god. Okay, you know what? I don't even want to know. But with his help, the reign of the Sun Children was brought to an end. He basically just overthrew the government and said, "Hey, I'm god now, guys. Listen to me." That's Orobashi for you. He's a cool dude. I like him. We don't actually have a lot of concrete information about Orobashi's rules specifically, but we do know he was pretty well received and wanted to bring his people back to the surface, which again is kind of weird because Archon War, he was losing, Anyway, he at some point created a new island on the surface called Watatsumi Island out of the blood coral branches that grew on his body, and he began to teach the people of Enkanomiya the customs and language of the Narukami Island, since he was gonna be around there. But this is also kind of weird because the seal that had kept the people of Enkanomiya underground was apparently weakening, and that's how he was able to get back up, and the people never tried it themselves. You know what? Never mind. There's a lot of these moments. I'm just saying. But while he was teaching all of his people about Narukami's culture, he also had to educate himself on Enkanomiya's culture and history, and that's when he stumbled upon a forbidden book. The book known as Before Sun and Moon, and it is the bane of my existence as a theorist. I hate this book. The contents of this book put Orobashi on Celestia's hit list, since it was top secret information, and Celestia charged both Orobashi and his people with several transgressions, enough to warrant all of them the death penalty. Orobashi, however, being a wonderful god, made a deal with Celestia. He would sacrifice himself, and Celestia's secrets would be locked away in the underground. Celestia agreed to this deal and allowed Orobashi some time to prepare, I'm guessing because otherwise this timeline is even more screwy than it already is. This act would in fact spare the people of Enkanomiya's life, but obviously Orobashi would die, so he had to ensure the future of his people when he wouldn't be around. So it should be around this time that he ordered some studies into the Bishop species, which seems weird if no context is provided. But his ultimate goal here was to be able to successfully graft his blood coral branches onto the Vishaps so that the people of Watatsumi would be able to have a source for the blood coral long after he died. If you're wondering why on earth they would need that, it's because Watatsumi Island was basically made from Orobashi's blood coral, so if he died, there would be no way to replenish the fertility of it, so to speak. And eventually, nothing would grow, which means they would die of starvation and famine. And anyway, this phenomenon is later known as bleaching, and there's a whole quest about it, and you kind of have to do it to unlock Enkanomiya, if you even remember that that's why we were doing this in the first place, right? We had to go down and retrieve the jade coral branch, which is the same thing as a blood coral branch, except it's from the Vishaps. Anyway, eventually the Bishop experiments were successful, so every some odd years, again, someone from Watatsumi is tasked with going down to Enkanomiya and retrieving some blood coral from the Vishaps to restore life to their island. Okay, so, blood coral issues settled, Orobashi began the process of finally moving everyone to the surface, but on Enkanomiya's last day, they received some, shall we say, unexpected visitors. Delegates from the underground nation of Conria. This is why there are those robo-enemies everywhere, just in case you were wondering. The Conrians were looking for the very book that Orobashi promised Celestia he would hide away. And Conria was also unsuccessful in obtaining it, so Orobashi did a good job. Although it wasn't really him, it was, random dude that fought a ruined garden, lost the book, and it accidentally got hidden, but anyway. So Conria was unsuccessful in getting the book they wanted, and they are still unsuccessful about 2,000 years later, at least if our buddy Enjo here is anything to go by. And I think he's probably somewhat reliable, kind of. I mean, I know he's an Abyss Herald, but, Conrians aside, Orobashi managed to complete the migration of his people from the underground to the surface, and then he led a small army to attack Yashiori Island under the guise of wanting more fertile land for his people. It was there that he was struck down by Raiden A, and therefore successfully upheld his end of the bargain with Celestia. And this concludes the actual story of Enkanomiya. You probably noticed that I have left out a lot of details. And some of those things are actually really inconsequential, some of them are just fun, and some of them require their, own deep dives later on, and I will get into them. But what I've presented here is basically all you kinda need to know from the whole area. But there are some things I'd like to talk about now, just kind of speculate and have a little thinksies, while everything's still fresh. Let's talk about these sorts of things. First on this list, just let me complain about this friggin' timeline. And then we'll talk about Kairos, the Sin Shades, and Conria, and everything in between. Okay, so to start with, I'm going to give you a super rough concept of Tevat's timeline just for reference material. It's really, really, really rough, okay? Now, Zhongli, or Morax, is the oldest deity that we actually have an age for, or at least an approximate age for. He's 6,000 years old, or a little bit more than that. That's literally the oldest actual date we have on record. Now, approximately 2,500 years after that, the Archon War began. About 1,500 years after that, the Archon War ends. This allows for about 2,000 years to pass between the end of the Archon War and the current timeline. All right? Now, the Genesis events outlined in Before Sun and Moon seem to have taken place before Morax was even born. So that's all pre-6,000 years ago, and that probably includes the time period that the Seelies existed in as well. Now bear with me. You remember how I said the total time of Enkanomiya's underground existence was maybe 200 years according to the Byakuyakoku books? Well, good, because we're going to try and place this 200-year span into this timeline. Now, in the funerary year, in Before Sun and Moon, it's stated that it was the War of the Second Throne that caused Enkanomiya to sink. This kind of has to be the Archon War, but that's kind of where things get really weird. See, Orobashi was killed at the end of the Archon War, which means that Enkanomiya had to fall 200 years prior to that moment, so the tail end of the 1,500-year war. But Enkanomiya was said to be part of one unified civilization, and yet Narukami culture is different from that of Enkanomiya. But Narukami culture wouldn't have developed until the Electro Archon had at least somewhat claimed her throne, and even then, it would have needed some time to develop. And even if we assume that, they were ruling the region before they won the war, that actually screws the timeline even more, so I'm not even going to consider that right now. But beyond that, further still, Enkanomiya fell and was sealed beneath the ground by the Primordial One, supposedly. And that seal had to weaken for Orobashi to fall beneath the seal that weakened. And he'd have had to have fallen after Narukami had developed a culture, or else how would he be knowledgeable enough to teach it? And also, the people of Enkanomiya didn't pray to any god like the Inazuman equivalent of Morax or Guizhong or Havria or Decarabia. They prayed to the Primordial One and his shades, which would have preceded all other gods, which makes Enkanomiya really, 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 really old. Pre-Archon War, pre-Morax. More than 6,000 years ago. But they only really existed for roughly 200 years. So you see, there's this small little paradox of time that I don't like. Basically, I have two hypotheses. Either the people of Enkanomiya were not normal humans that lived for only 100 years each, and therefore a son and children's reign could be more like 500 years each or something, or time doesn't actually move the same way at Enkanomiya as it does in Tevat, or maybe it's both. I don't know. There's not enough information. I can make a somewhat questionable case for the time not moving the same way in Enkanomiya as it does in Tevat, but it's complicated and I don't actually have a solid conclusion that makes any sense. On the one hand, Enkanomiya has a lot of floating, broken elements that mimic some of the structures we've seen in domains. And domains in general seem to all be snapshots in time, so you could kind of argue that Enkanomiyans were living in what basically constitutes as a domain, and therefore that time didn't move. But maybe it moved for people, but not for... I don't... But Then, on the other hand, we know that the Enkanomians worshipped the goddess Kairos as one of the primordial one's shades. She was also known as the Tokoyo Omikami and as the Thousand Winds of Time. They claimed to be able to hear her voice under unspecified conditions, and the sin shades of the people we encountered on our travels there were said to be a result of her power. People experiencing powerful emotions or those that undergo a specific ritual could effectively leave a semi-sentient imprint of themselves, kind of like an advanced pre-recorded video or hologram message that you could interact with, like a choose-your-own-adventure. So the presence of Kairos alone lets us make a case for the idea that time is all mucky-wucky down here beneath the sea. And we also know, courtesy of Child, that time in the Abyss flows differently than that of Tevat, in something like a 30-to-1 ratio. Or rather, time moves 30 times faster in the Abyss than it does in Tevat. Is Enkanomiya the Abyss? Maybe, maybe not. The instructions are very unclear. However, Child's experience of 1 month in the Abyss for every 1 day in Tevat goes against the experience of Enkanomiya. In fact, it should be the other way around. Assuming we only have around 200 years accounted for in Enkanomiya and at least a 1,500-year war to account for on the surface, time would need to move at least 8 times slower. If you moved it 30 times slower, then it would put us back around 6,000 years, which would mean Enka would have fallen around the time Zhongli descended, which doesn't seem quite right, but might put its fall closer to the War of the First Throne rather than the second, or that the first throne was actually like way long ago and that there was a second throne and that the second who came is not the same thing as the second throne, that there might actually be a third throne, which is the current throne in power, and no matter what you do here, it's really weird, all right? It's just weird. I don't like it. I have no answers, just the conclusion that time is really mucky-wucky in the underground, or that people have super long lifespans. Either or. It could be both. I'm not sure. But speaking of time, let's talk about this supposed god of time, Kairos. Not in depth, mind you, that's for another video, but I'd like to make a couple of really weird notes while we're kind of on the topic. First off, the ancient Greeks had 2 words for time, Chronos and Kairos. The thing is that both of these words were used for different types of time. Chronos was like cumulative time, history, an accumulation of all the events that ever were or ever will be. But Kairos referred to moments, specific instances in time. MiHoYo definitely knows this distinction because when talking about her, they say, quote, "She was the moment. She was every moment. She was the measure of 1,000 winds and the sun and the moon. She was every second of joy, every moment of rage, every instant of longing, every minute of obsession. She was every flash of delirium." There are some really key choices of words there, all pointing to the fact that Kairos is only looking at tiny snippets in time and not all of time itself. So you can tell here that MiHoYo is very aware of the difference between Chronos and Kairos, which makes me wonder if she was chosen not because she's actually the god of time or that she's the only god of time, but... Okay, see, here's the thing. There's something else at play here. There is actually a Greek god named Kairos, and he was more commonly known as the god of thieves because he ruled over the perfect moment, or like the moment of a golden opportunity. Thieves always wait until the perfect moment to strike, hence the association. For the same reason, he was associated with archery, because Kairos was how they referred to the instant where the arrow was released from the bow. Does this remind you of anyone? Because between Kairos' association with time, the 1,000 winds, thieves, and archery, the only person that comes to my mind is Venti. And that guy was literally born from the branches of time, source in the description, which only makes this weirder. It's possible that Venti was only one of Kairos' 1,000 winds, but I don't really want to think about the possibility that there were 999 other Ventis out there somewhere, because that's a little weird. But still, the fact that Kairos, as a general mythological description, is really reminiscent of Venti is just odd to me. and really suspicious. But I digress. I don't actually have any answers here either, just something I wanted to point out, some food for thought. Maybe you'll find this interesting, maybe you won't, I don't know. But anyway, I have 2 more big takeaways here I actually want to talk about. Primarily, I want to point out that Enkanomiya is basically based on ancient Greece. And okay, I know that you knew all that. I mean, we've been talking about Greek for, like several minutes now anyway. But, do you understand what the significance of that is? Because it's actually kind of important. To put it simply, and not to go too in-depth on it, Gnosticism actually has a lot of Greek roots, and it borrows quite a bit from Greek philosophy and mythology. Since Gnosticism is Genshin's primary theme, this kind of matters. Enkanomiya was also a part of a single unified culture, which means 100% of Teyvat at one point was actually ancient Greece. And this explains why all the elements are using Greek terminology. The game literally has Greek roots. Dendro, Pyro, Hydro, Animo. Animo is actually really funny because Animo doesn't actually mean wind. It's referring to the Anemoi, which is this whole other thing that we'll probably go into if we ever do a deep dive into Venti, but I'm just saying they're all Greek terms. Now, we didn't touch on the Genesis myth of Teyvat at all because it's not actually relevant to Enkanomiya specifically, at least for its timeline, and it deserves its own video, which I will do. But I do kind of want to Phanes and the primordial one because they kind of give a little bit more context into what branch of Greek myth we're actually dealing with, because there are more than one, which you may or may not have been aware of. I guess that depends on your exposure. So Phanes specifically is only referred to by that name in the Orphic cosmogony, which is very different from the cosmogony of Hesiod, which is kind of the one that everyone thinks of when they think of Greek mythology. The cosmogony of Hesiod is the be-all, end-all of what everyone assumes to be Greek myth, but I digress. Orphic cosmogony, or Orphism, is kind of considered a mystery cult. It was a branch or an alternative view, I guess, to the creation of ancient Greece. Now, Orphism changes up the lineup of gods in the initial creation myths and also introduces the concept of the world egg. Well, at least it introduces it to Greek myth. But now, Phanes hatched from said world egg, and thus became the god of creation, specifically. I know he's usually referred to as being very much like the elder Eros, who's supposed to be the god of love, but technically Eros was also a creation god, because love and copulation makes creation and never mind. The point is that effectively all of the gods that were born or came into being around the time of Phanes, or either before or slightly after, so long as they came before the Titans, they were considered primordial gods, which should sound familiar because that's actually the name of this game. Now, some of the Enkanomiyans share names with these primordial gods, and it throws me off. Specifically, Erebus, or Eboshi, notably, is actually a primordial god of darkness in the Orphic myths, but in Enkanomiya, she is just a normal lady. And then there's Abrax, who's named after Abraxas, which, in Gnosticism, is considered either the Great Archon, or the supreme god of all gods, or an Aeon alongside Sophia. And Sophia was the one who birthed the Demiurge, who in this case would be Phanes, and Phanes was already considered a Demiurge in Orphism, so that would make Abrax technically a primordial god since he came before Phanes, right? You're starting to see kind of the weirdness here, because either these people were actually gods of sorts, or they're just named after these gods, which is weird for completely different reasons. Or maybe MiHoYo's just sitting in their office going and they have some other explanation that they're not actually going to give us. And maybe it's just for fun. Who knows? How do you differentiate the lore from the references from the Easter eggs? I don't know. I just guess. I just throw darts at things, and if that sticks, I'm like, ooh, cool, that's a new thing. There's also the possibility that the names are just a reference to their position within Enkanomiya alone, Abrax being kind of like the supreme creator in Enkanomiya because he was the creator of the Helios. But I guess that still doesn't explain the use of the name Phanes, but let's not go there for now. I'll be doing a deep dive into this topic in another video. I just kind of wanted to bring up that there's some oddness going here, and it's kind of tied into the timeline because they might actually be god-ish like things, but I don't know. The last thing I want to touch on for now is the Conrian delegate that showed up on the last day of Enkanomiya. Up until this point, we were mostly under the assumption, or at least I was, that Conria was more or less isolated in an unknown location underground somewhere, secretly. And yet, they were able to not only locate, but navigate to Enkanomiya with a rather large arsenal and retinue, That kind of implies that there's probably at least a system of underground tunnels beneath Tevat, and that there's probably more than just Enkanomiya down here. Possibly some regions with living people, which would be really interesting to see. Also, at this point of time, nearly 2,000 years ago in Tevat time, Conria had already gotten pretty far on their robot tech. They had at least completed up until their Ruin Cruiser class, which means that out there somewhere are some even bigger, meaner, scarier, more advanced robots, and I'm a little worried. I mean, by this logic, they only got wiped out 500 years ago. That leaves 1,500 years of progress for them to, develop this whole arsenal of additional, robots, and that's kind of crazy. It also means Conria is older than 2,000 years old, which is kind of crazy, because we're pretty sure that Sol Vendignir was talking about a civilization that was being built underground without gods that was being developed roughly about 2,000 years ago. So either they were very new and already had their robot tech, or they are actually older than 2,000 years and time is all mucky-wucky again, and I'm sorry, I got really distracted by the robots. I think the biggest highlight here, apart from the robots, is that Conria was actually looking for the very book that got Orobashi killed. I know that's a bit of a whiplash in topic. But this means that while Conria was a nation without gods, it might not have been a nation that did not believe in gods. It just might have been a nation that was loyal to the first throne, or the primordial god, as it was probably more of a hands-off god, one that didn't really meddle in the affairs of mortals. It just kind of existed, and Conria recognized it, and that was that, right? So maybe they weren't necessarily against gods in general, but instead against the rule of the second throne, since, Conria was looking for proof of the second throne's doings in the book before Sun and Moon. In fact, the fact that they're searching for this book only serves to further disprove the idea that Gold, the alchemist, was solely responsible for the cataclysm of 500 years ago, as it likely wasn't part of some mad woman's accidental experiment, but instead a culmination of many things, including Conria's refusal to bow to the second throne. She, like Orobashi, would have been the one to just take the brunt of the blame. I have thoughts, so many thoughts, too many thoughts, all as a result of this place, but I think I'll just leave it here for now. I'll be expanding on some of these ideas in later videos and exploring other ideas that I didn't even get around to mentioning here, and even a little bit of Honkai Impact lore too, so keep an eye out for these new videos. They're gonna be interesting. I'm shifting gears a little bit. But while you wait for those, why don't you tell me all about your Enkanomiyan experience? Is there anything weird down here that I've missed? I'm sure there is. There's so much down here. But what questions are bothering you the most? Because I could list another 10 or 20s. Why don't you share yours with me so I don't have to think about mine? Please? I'm begging. Well, regardless, let me know down in the comments. As I depart, I would like to thank you all for watching. Take care, guys. I will catch you all in the next video. It's gonna be a doozy.